every summer. The biggest harvest loss happens while the tomato plant still looks perfectly healthy. The leaves stay green. New flowers keep opening. Nothing seems wrong. And that's exactly why almost nobody notices it. By the time those little yellow flowers quietly disappear, next month's tomatoes have already disappeared with them. For years, I blamed the heat, the soil, bad luck, until I stopped watching the fruit and started watching one ordinary week in June. What happened during those 7 mornings changed the way I grow tomatoes forever. For the first few mornings, nothing asks for attention. The leaves stay green. New flowers keep arriving. The garden looks exactly the way a healthy tomato garden should. That's usually when people stop looking. And that's exactly when the season quietly changes. Not in a single afternoon. One flower never becomes fruit. One tiny stem stops stretching. One small cluster simply freezes while every other branch keeps growing. Nothing dramatic happens. Until one morning, 2 tomato plants growing side by side no longer seem to be telling the same story. One is filling with tiny green tomatoes. The other is still covered with flowers. At first glance, they look equally healthy, but they are no longer building the same harvest. And here's the part almost nobody notices. The losing plant didn't make that decision today. It made it several mornings earlier, when every leaf was still green, every flower was still open, and there was absolutely no reason to think anything was wrong. By now, the easy answer should be obvious. Weak plants produce fewer tomatoes. Except, this plant doesn't look weak at all. The leaves are still deep green. The top is still reaching higher. Fresh flowers keep opening every morning. And that's exactly why the harvest quietly disappears. Most gardeners judge tomato plants by the leaves. Experienced growers watch something smaller, the tiny stem behind each flower. Look closely tomorrow morning. Some stems will already be swelling into tiny fruit. Others will look exactly the same as they did yesterday. No yellowing, no collapse, no obvious damage. Just a decision you almost missed. Commercial growers have a name for this: flower abortion. Once that process begins, most flowers never get a second chance. The plant isn't failing to grow. It's editing the harvest, keeping the flowers it believes it can finish, and quietly abandoning the ones that cost more than they're worth. And that changes the question completely. The problem isn't, what is this plant missing? It's, what happened during those quiet mornings that convinced a healthy plant to give up a tomato that never even had the chance to exist? When most people judge a tomato season, they count the fruit. Experienced gardeners count something much earlier: the flowers that quietly stayed. Every morning, the plant makes hundreds of tiny energy decisions. Most move forward. Some simply stop. No yellow leaves. No wilted stems. No obvious warning. Just a flower that never begins to swell. And a tomato that never gets the chance to exist. Try one simple experiment. Choose 3 flower clusters tomorrow morning. Take a photo. Come back 2 days later. You'll notice something surprising. Some tiny stems are already pushing forward into fruit. Others haven't changed at all. The decision happened long before the plant ever looked stressed. That's why disappointing harvests feel so mysterious. The basket doesn't become empty overnight. It becomes lighter, one unnoticed flower at a time. And once you learn to spot that tiny difference, you stop reacting to a failed harvest. You start protecting it, while it's still only a yellow flower. Morning one didn't begin with fertilizer. It began with a single observation. 2 tomato plants, the same soil, the same sunlight, the same watering schedule, yet one kept every flower, while the other quietly let them go. The difference appeared long before anyone could count tomatoes. Look closely at the center of a successful flower. Within a day or two, a tiny green swelling begins to appear. That tiny swelling is the plant quietly saying, "I'm keeping this one." Walk through a garden after bloom, and you'll notice something most people never see. Some flower clusters already carry rows of tiny green fruit. Others still hold flowers that never move forward. The decision has already been made. Researchers studying this short transition keep finding the same pattern. When calcium and boron are available while the flower is making that decision, more flowers continue into fruit, and fewer quietly disappear. Not because the plant suddenly grows faster, because fewer flowers are abandoned. It's a tiny difference in June, but by harvest, it becomes empty spaces, or branches heavy enough to bend toward the ground. For a moment, that sounds like the missing answer. Except it isn't. Because even perfectly nourished plants can still lose flowers after only a few hot afternoons, which means something even stronger than nutrition is influencing the decision. And that's exactly what the next morning reveals. By the third morning, the difference finally becomes visible, not in the leaves. In how quickly the plant starts growing again. Walk through the garden just after sunrise. One tomato plant is already lifting its newest stems toward the light. The flower clusters feel firm. Tiny green fruit continue pushing forward. A few steps away, another plant still looks healthy, but nothing is moving. The flowers stay open. The newest stems seem frozen. Empty flower scars quietly replace the fruit that should have been there. Both plants survive the same heat. Both receive the same water. But they did not return to building at the same speed. And that changes everything. After heat stress, the strongest tomato plant is rarely the one with the darkest leaves. It's the one that resumes fruit building first. That's the detail most gardeners never measure. They ask, did the plant survive? The plant is answering a different question. Am I safe enough to keep investing in fruit? Stay in recovery too long, and the next flowers quietly disappear. For a moment, that feels like the missing answer. Help the plant recover faster. Protect the flowers. Keep the harvest moving. Except, 1 week later, another surprise appears. Some plants recover perfectly. Deep green leaves, fresh growth, healthy flowers, and still stop setting fruit, which means heat was never the real decision. It only revealed something that was already happening underneath. By the fifth morning, the difference is no longer happening in the flowers. It's happening inside the leaves. At sunrise, both tomato plants still look almost identical. Now try something most gardeners never think to do. Touch a leaf on each plant an hour later. One still feels cool and firm. The other already feels softer. The flowers haven't changed. The color hasn't changed, but the plant has. It is losing water faster than it can replace it, and every extra hour spent in that state makes another flower too expensive to keep. That's why the best tomato plants don't always grow faster. They simply stay comfortable longer. They hold their flowers. They keep building tiny fruit, while neighboring plants quietly pause. Come back 3 mornings in a row, and you'll start seeing the pattern. The same plant keeps moving forward. The same plant keeps keeping its flowers. Those invisible hours slowly become visible harvest. One extra tomato, then an entire cluster, then branches heavy enough to bend toward the ground. And this changes the question completely. Maybe June isn't about feeding the plant more. Maybe it's about protecting the few morning hours, when the plant quietly decides whether tomorrow's harvest is worth keeping. For a moment, that feels like the missing answer. Except, if you could keep only one foliar spray for that entire week, which one actually protects those hours? And which ones only make the leaves look healthier? By the 7th morning, you no longer need to guess. Take a photo of the same tomato plant you photographed 6 days ago. Don't look at the height. Don't count the leaves. Look behind the flowers. That's where the week has been writing its story. One plant now carries rows of tiny green tomatoes, each one quietly replacing a flower that stayed. A few feet away, another plant still looks perfectly healthy. Fresh leaves, fresh flowers, fresh growth, but empty spaces keep appearing between them. The difference isn't color. It isn't size. It's direction. One plant is investing in tomorrow. The other is spending today trying to recover yesterday. That's why this week matters. Most disappointing harvests don't begin with dying plants. They begin with healthy plants that quietly stop moving forward. And this is where the experiment finally changed my mind. The spray that protected the most fruit wasn't the one that made the leaves greener. It was the one that helped the plant keep saying yes to one more flower, morning after morning. By the 2nd week, the routine no longer feels like feeding a tomato plant. It feels like protecting a decision. The first mist lands across fresh flowers just after sunrise. Nothing changes that morning. No greener leaves. No sudden growth. No instant miracle. But the flowers survive the hottest hours. And that is all the plant needed. Here's the strange part. Most foliar sprays don't fail because of the formula. They fail because of the clock. Spray too late, and the leaf begins closing before it can absorb much of anything. Spray into rising heat, and droplets disappear before they ever become useful. The product gets the blame. The timing was the real problem. And if I could keep only one foliar spray for that week, it would be a simple calcium and boron spray. Not because it forces faster growth, but because it helps one more flower survive. The moment the plant is deciding what to keep, tomorrow morning, walk into the garden before the air begins to feel warm. Touch a leaf. If it still feels cool, if the flowers are fully open, and the sunlight has only begun reaching the top of the plant, you're in the window. Miss it by an hour, and the same bottle suddenly becomes far less effective. The biggest improvement in tomato production often comes from doing exactly the same thing at a completely different time. And yet, there is still one habit that quietly destroys all of those careful mornings, and almost every gardener repeats it without ever noticing. The habit that quietly destroys all those careful mornings isn't forgetting fertilizer. It isn't missing a watering day. It isn't choosing the wrong spray. It's arriving after the decision has already been made. By the time most gardeners walk into the garden, the leaves are already warm. The flowers have already started closing. The plant has already decided which fruit is worth carrying. Nothing looks wrong, but the opportunity is already gone. That's why experienced gardeners seem almost unfair. They don't react faster. They simply notice earlier. Tomorrow morning, before you pick up the hose, stop at the first flower you see. Look behind the petals. If a tiny green swelling is already there, the plant is still moving forward. If it isn't, don't panic. Come back the next morning. Watch again. After a few days, you'll begin seeing a pattern that most gardeners never notice. And once you see it, the question changes forever. You stop asking, how do I grow bigger tomatoes? You start asking, how do I help one more flower survive today? Because the heaviest harvests are rarely built by dramatic interventions. They're built by dozens of tiny decisions, noticed early enough to matter. 7 mornings. That was the only difference. The camera never moved. The fence stayed exactly where it had always been. Yet every morning, another tiny decision had already been made. Morning 1, a flower stayed. Morning 3, a tiny green fruit appeared. Morning 5, the leaves recovered before the heat could take another flower. Morning 7, one plant was still surviving. The other was already building a harvest. Nothing looked extraordinary. No miracle fertilizer. No overnight transformation. Only dozens of flowers that quietly stayed. And that became the harvest. Tomorrow morning, before you pick up the hose, stop at the first tomato flower you see. Look behind the petals. If a tiny green swelling is already there, the season is moving forward. If it isn't, don't panic. Simply come back the next morning and watch again. That's how experienced gardeners learn to read a tomato plant. And once you notice that tiny decision, it's surprisingly difficult to walk past another flower without stopping.